Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third meeting of the Projectiology Bridge Book Club. So tonight we're going to be discussing chapters 7 to 16 of the Scientific Foundations of Conscientiology. And first, just a few reminders that we will be recording the first part of the meeting, and then we're going to stop the recording when we have our breakout sessions where we share our experiences. And then we're going to start recording again where Magali will present the technique for the month and she'll also close the meeting. So during the meeting, you can also use the raise your hand function in Zoom if you want to say something or ask a question, or you can also use the chat function on the right-hand side, or simply unmute yourself and start speaking. So in a few minutes, we're going to have a little online poll where we ask you a few questions. So you can get ready by clicking on the link in the chat where it says, please log in to the online poll. And you can click there, or you can scan the QR code on the screen. And Fernandez will show that QR code. And while you're doing that, we'd like to introduce our facilitators of this meeting, Jeffrey Lloyd and Kim McCall. Jeffrey Lloyd is a university-educated independent researcher and has been a teacher of the neurosciences of projectiology and conscientiology since 1999. He currently resides in Australia and is involved in projects to help expand and internationalize conscientiology, consciousness research, and self-experimentation. Kim McCall is a consulting anthropologist in the field of Australian Aboriginal land rights. He has been studying conscientiology since 1997. His research interests include cross-cultural understandings of consciousness, consciential assistance, evolutionology, and para-reurbanization, but really all aspects of our multidimensional reality. He has written several articles on consciousness and the book Multidimensional Evolution, Personal Explorations of Consciousness. He also hosts a podcast called Multidimensional Evolution. Originally from Germany, Kim currently resides in Adelaide, Australia with his 3 kids. So welcome, Jeff and Kim. And before I hand it over to you, we would like to do a brief poll. So if everyone could please sign into the poll. And I'll bring it up so that we can all see it. Okay, so the first question is, let me just share the screen here. So the first question is, how is everyone doing with your reading? Are you keeping up with the reading and you've read the chapters for the month? You're a little behind, but you're continuing to read. You're behind and you've kind of stopped reading, given it a break, or you're not reading. So it looks like 25% are keeping up with the reading, which is great. 44% are a little behind, but continuing to read, which is great. And no one has given up yet, so that's great. And some people haven't started reading or are currently not reading, and there could be reasons for that. So let's have a look at the next question here.
I only got access to one question when I went on there.
Oh yeah, I'll start it now. Here you go. Should be able to access that now. So if you're not keeping up with your reading, in a few words, what is the reason? So you'll need to type that in. You know, it could be you don't have time, no time, it's not interesting, it's difficult, you've already read the book. So interested to see some reasons from people here. Yeah, so some of the reasons why we're seeing here is it's the subject is difficult. You know, some people have already read the book, some people don't have any time, or they've read the book already, or maybe some challenges with the language, which is common. And we just wanted to get a feel of, you know, how you guys are feeling with the reading. So it's really good to know that kind of we're all kind of in the same situation. You know, we're all very, very busy with our lives, and just to encourage you, this is it's a difficult book to read. It's quite technical at times. Um, so just to encourage everyone to, you know, participate in the forum if you have any questions, reach out to us if you're having challenges with the neologisms or, you know, the language, the English. We're here to support you and to help each other. This is a study group. So yeah, please reach out, okay, if you're having any difficulties with the reading. And it's great that to see that no one has given up quite yet. So we have a long journey ahead of us. So it's great to have this group. That's exactly what it's for. Okay, so thanks for participating in that. And I'll hand it over to our facilitators, Kim and Jeff.
Hi everyone, nice to see new and old friends. We've sort of split the chapters between us, and I'll be covering off the first ones that we chose, and then Kim will handle the rest. So forgive me if I dominate talking for a little bit, but we'll get through that, and then Kim will have his share. But obviously, please do, Kim, please jump in anytime and any contributions, and I'll try to open up that for your input as well, and anyone else who wants to make a comment as we go along.
I'm just going to try and get into proper presentation mode here.
Down to the bottom right,
Down
you'll
the
see
bottom.
like a little screen.
Oh yeah, here we
yeah, that
yes.
guy. Click on him, and he'll give you, I think, what you're after.
Okay.
There we go. So starting with chapter 7, which is the first sort of chapter for this section of reading, and it's a really, really rich chapter. So most of what I'm talking about or we'll talk about is around around this. So and again, this is sort of just, you know, things that called my attention most. You could probably do your own summary of chapters and the highlights for you in each of these individual you know, collections of ideas here, but it's just worth, I suppose, understanding and trying to set the scene in terms of, well, what is science? Because a lot of people are very critical of, you know, well, projectiology and conscientiology aren't a science, right? So you hear that in lots of circles, but more so in the more orthodox scientific circles. And the challenge for them is many and varied, because and we'll try to explain why that is, and what we can do to perhaps understand and be comfortable in ourselves about, well, you know, no, it's valid to have and to study these kinds of subjects in a scientific way, and what can we do in that regard. So that's what we'll try and set the scene here to do. So, you know, it's clearly projectiology per se. It's a heterodox type of science, so not the orthodox type that we've got noted there, and it's very much focused around, you know, the consciousness. Just a general observation of science, like scientific work is the rigid and involves the rigid integrity of thought, and this is an interesting concept that accompanies the evidence of facts. So we're just trying to observe the facts, and based on that, elaborate our thoughts, but in the most how should I say, clean, clear, precise, accurate, useful way possible. So, oh, I had an out-of-body experience, or I had a thing like a dream, but it seemed very different from a dream, because I was talking and I was chatting and I was feeling things and I felt energies. I had a shower of energies on my head, and I felt more intelligent than I do day to day. and that's really not what we typically experience in a classical dream. So those were my facts. That was my personal experience. You know, something could have triggered that, but let me try to understand that experience. And so what we're trying to do with science is, you know, focused on this last point here, you know, conclusions that we reach, they have an undeniable character of approximations of certainty. So we're trying to get closer and closer to being more certain. So, you know, it's not like if we believe and we're blind about something, we can just jump and say, yeah, it's completely that, at 100%, you know, no doubt, no worries. But that's not really how it works, and that's not a very scientific approach. What we're trying to do is be constantly refining our understanding, look for the causes and the relationships between different facts and actions, and evocations, particularly in our areas, becomes very strong, right? Because we have to observe the more subtle facts to try to understand the different connections between things. Kim, was there any observation you wanted to make on any of those points?
No, not at this point. I was just, one thing I was curious about, whether those passages are quotes from the book or paraphrases. I was just wondering that, like, when you rigid integrity of thought and so on.
Yeah, so some are direct quotes. So if you go through there, many of them are direct quotes. Sometimes just for conciseness, I've paraphrased a little bit. Yeah, so they are all in chapter 7 though, and we will see those there. The bolding, sometimes I did the bolding, sometimes it's the bolding or the italicizing that's in the book. So it's just really more for this audience. It's not verbatim from the book in every case, but you will see those ideas in there. Yeah. Can we jump to the next slide, Bill?
Yeah, I'm just trying to
drive the machine.
Yeah, where is it?
Arrow across on the keyboard.
Oh, yeah. No, I thought, yeah, I did. Yeah, all right, all good.
Technology's a whiz. And particularly in these sciences that we're studying, right, they're more a social science. So there's a few observations to make around those. And again, these are all from the book. These aren't my creations. In human sciences, the repetition of a vital historical situation, or any historical situation, not necessarily vital, it's always impossible to basically recreate. So we act differently. We act spontaneously. We have free will. We have liberty. Things change, right? So even if I were to repeat that last sentence I've just said, I wouldn't be able to say it in exactly the same way, with all the same intonations, the same volume, the same facial expressions. It would be different. So we're in a scientific mode, or in a type of science which has challenges in this regard. And the scientific world, our sort of a view of a reality, never completely incorporates every facet of the real world, right? We tend to select certain characteristics and say and accept them as true, right? And the path of science is actually to disprove certain things. So you have your theories, and you're often trying to disprove that theory, because then that way you'll come up with a better theory. When you become absolute about something and don't challenge it, then it becomes very stagnant. It becomes a different kind of a game, so to speak. And so projectiology, conscientiology, as a social science, and social sciences per se, they doubtlessly occupy the last place in the hierarchy of sciences with regard to their relative degree of precision and the rigor of their results. Their study is thus far more difficult. So, you know, this is, for me, it's one of the sort of perhaps a key concept, is that yes, it's a social science like a psychology or a parapsychology, and we even mentioned those on another slide. But it's very difficult. You know, it's not like a tool that you can measure and you can quantify in a really easy way. It's much more difficult than that. So it deserves a lot of credit for what has already been able to be achieved in terms of research and results and studying and understanding something that is very difficult. But also we should feel just comfortable, I think, to say, well, you know, science in this regard, as a social science, they are inherently less precise than some of the hard orthodox kinds of sciences. And so, you know, all the efforts, and I think in the scientific world are of value. Well, not all, but, you know, in general, science is a positive thing. And I think, you know, we should feel very comfortable that studying something that looks so ephemeral and so hard to define and spooky, or a lot of scientists use the expression woo-woo, like woo, that's woo, that's weird, that's too out there. I think they're actually lacking missing a big opportunity to actually deepen their own self-knowledge and understanding of humanity as opposed to just the physical world. But anyway, each to their own and in their own time. It's obviously an area where we're in and we're interested in studying, and that's why we're here. But that's an interesting idea. And I had forgotten that Dr. Vieira had actually, you know, no, it is a social science. It is, you know, relatively imprecise compared to some other types of sciences. But there are no pseudosciences in the strictest sense. There is no truly exact science. It's important to remember that, I think. Any
Yeah,
thoughts there, Kim?
I would like to just add, like, it's nice to reread the book, because like you, Jeff, I'd forgotten that that's a point that Valdo actually makes. And I, you know, over the years, I've often in my mind sort of struggled with the concept of, you know, it doesn't really work to describe conscientiology as a science. You know, I think we should describe it as a social science. And I had clearly had cryptomnesia, so I'd forgotten that I actually read that Valdo says that. But the other thing I would say just about social sciences is, you know, as an anthropologist, which is a social science, which has a long history within the discipline of struggling with being recognized as a science. It's really interesting working as I do in a legal context where, you know, you have to establish, create, set up evidence to convince a judge of certain facts, and to see how that is in fact very possible in the social science, and perhaps not in the way that we would have in say medical science, chemistry, whatever, physics, those kinds of things, where you can, you know, replicate experiments in exactly the same ways. As you said, we can't do that with the social science, but we can nonetheless establish facts, at least to the sort of level of beyond reasonable doubt test. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind.
That subjective nature of the things is a really relevant point, right? Like, you're interpreting, you're doing that exact thing, the approximation of certainty. You're trying to get closer and closer to being certain about what did historically happen in that region, what you know, what is the connection of that tribe or those people with that given area, and you're trying to build that up. So it's a really interesting analogy that you make in terms of the anthropological field. Do you want to jump to the next slide and we'll see what's there?
Yep.
So again, here, just sort of, you know, taking bits out of the chapter and putting them in here. You know, again, it's a moral and a social science, conscientiology and projectiology, and all the sub-sciences of conscientiology, because of its, you know, its inherent humane, human, consciousness-based nature. And historically, it looks like it comes from a bit of a trail from psychology, parapsychology, or the metaphysics, as it was, or metapsychics, I think, from France, I think, was where they were really strong in that area. And then projectiology. Here in science of personal interactions, which all of those aforementioned ones are, and as is projectiology and conscientiology, there's a reciprocal observance between the observed and the observer, right? So here in the picture, we're representing, I observe myself. So when in my bio, I put like the self-experimentation thing, that's I think the key point of what conscientiology and projectiology bring, an attempt to stimulate and to share and to provide tools and techniques and methods and laboratories and dynamics to help us to do exactly that. So what am I perceiving? You know, what's a better interpretation of that? Always trying to seek a better interpretation. Like, is it a consciousness around me, an extra physical consciousness? Is it just me, myself? You know, why today am I happier than I was yesterday? You know, why today is there a wave of more pressure and difficulty, and the energies and the consciousnesses around are more antagonistic. Why? Like we can't escape that. And also when we are observing ourselves, we obviously are interested in what's happening, and we obviously do a lot of modifications and changes on the run, right? Like we don't want to go through the day feeling depressed or sad or anxious or whatever. We want it to be enjoyable and nice, and you know, and we don't come here to suffer. So why not change what I'm thinking to make me feel better? Why not do a vibrational state to clear the air around me, to clear the energies, to clear my own stuff, and sort of reset me at a better baseline? Why not? So this whole self-experimentation thing, I think, is so key. And I wonder if Ulysses wants to make a comment now about self-experimentation. If you do, Ulysses, just take yourself off mute and start talking. But if not, no problem.
Next
So
slide,
science,
No.
please jump in.
No, that was me just checking whether the slide is done or.
Oh yeah, no, and just like just the idea of what you do, and taking notes. Like you must have heard thousands of times, take notes, record details of stuff. That's fundamental to what we're doing, right? So, and just remember, like regardless of whether you're doing orthodox science or heterodox science or whatever, a pure impersonal experience doesn't exist. There's always skin in the game. There's always a predispositions, tendencies, your energies going to the object of study, whether it's yourself or someone else or some object or whatever, and influencing. So it's just an important thing to remember that is always the case. So yep, next slide's good now, Kim. So, and as I've already mentioned, like parapsychism, feeling energies, dealing with extra physical consciousnesses and the like, that enriches your life, right? It helps you have much greater understanding about why you're feeling certain things, if it's really your thing or if it's somebody else's. It's a really great benefit to have heightened parapsychic or psychic sensitivity. But it does make things a little bit more complex. But that's not a bad thing, right? We have enough intelligence to be able to handle that, and we can learn. But we need to bear in mind and give ourselves a little bit of space that as complexity increases, so do the difficulties. So we can make more errors, there can be more omissions, we can have bad interpretations, things can become a little bit entropic at times, but that's all part of the learning process. If you're not experimenting, you're not gonna learn. But if you do take it as an experiment and you break the boundaries of what your family or your community or your tribe or whatever have defined, you're going to expand things in a good way, but you might get a bit of flow back against that, right? Like breaking the pattern, going against, not against traditions, but creating something new, will create a counterflow, right? And this links into an idea in a few slides time where we talk about this mantra. There's a mantra that Dr. Vera stumbled across in a certain out-of-body experience. It's detailed more in chapter 12, and not explicitly, but it's talked about quite a lot in that chapter. And so, we need ways and techniques to handle certain things. So always good to remember, and this is a question I think you should always try to ask yourself, what factors are present and are influencing the situation? Intraphysically, chemically within your body, biologically, age and so on, but extraphysically, parapsychically, energetically, what's going on? And a general one of these comments, it's like an idea there that I wanted to mention, like there is no end to the amount of knowledge we can acquire, right? We're not limited by our brain. The consciousness is actually something beyond the brain. We just use the brain to manifest here in the physical body. And we won't even be able to fill that up and use it fully, at least for a while, until we learn a few more tricks, right? And as a scientist, we can seek to have like maximum neutrality, so impartiality around stuff. You're not so pro or against certain things. You're more neutral and partial, and that gives you a cleaner baseline to then start to do reading on different things. and maximum universality in relation to the object of the study. So we want to not have a very narrow field that we're studying, but try to make it broad and wide, and there's not much that's wider than consciousness, would be the suggestion I could make. Any thoughts, Kim, or do you want to advance to the next
Yeah,
slide?
no, one thing that's just occurring for me as you're talking is how difficult it is if we are the object of study, our life situation, you know, our reactions, our experience day to day, having neutrality and so on can be very challenging because we're in it, right? So it's a very difficult object to study. And so listening to you really made me think of the importance of groupality, of working with other people, and of having ideally some kind of support network, study group in a way, to help us reflect things back to us, right? Where we can really run by, this is my life situation right now, these are the challenges, and get people with more neutral perspective to help us get that clarity, right? I think that really highlights that need.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah.
I'll let you read the other paragraph there, but the main thing I wanted to say here is like around this approximation of certainty and so on, you know, like scientific knowledge is not satisfied only with opinions. Everyone has an opinion, can have an opinion, right? It's not the point of the exercise. It's the idea of to get closer to and increase your degree of certainty around stuff. So again, narrowing down and refining your understanding, your intellectuality, reading more, studying more, feeling more in terms of energies and the like. And just quickly, the common question thing, a lot of people ask, yeah, well, where do we come from? Da, da, da. We don't know. And what comes after this? Da, da, da. Yeah, again, we don't know. There's a certain amount of information we have and understand and get, and it makes sense, at least in my head, the ideas and theories that Conscientiology present. But what was the origin of consciousness? We don't know. But and what comes after being in the pure mental dimension as a consciousness in that environment, we don't know. Okay, just to sort of leave that clear and not profess that, you know, we know everything. We just know a bit about what's in the middle between those things. If you want to jump to the next slide, Kim, feel free. I'm just conscious of time and I want to get you, you know, to your stuff pretty quickly. So again, very complex when you're dealing with parapsychism, and this looks like a repeat. So I think we can just jump this slide entirely, or have we gone back the other way as opposed to forward?
Oh, I'm not sure what happened there.
No, they could have, maybe it was a double on my side, but anyway. So this is the one, this is chapter 12. This is around precognitions, around projectiology. So Nostradamus, right, quatrains, he wrote a different books called, you know, Centuries. There's one in there and he talks about this idea of a mantra. So this is where Dr. Vieira was having a projection, and there was a lot of consciousness attacking him, and he felt like it was almost overwhelming and too much. And he thought, wow, and it's like there was like sort of a big red button that came to his, not a big red button, I'm just creating the image, but he remembered a mantra that basically once he repeated it out loud or in his mind in that environment, all those, it was like sort of just cleaning of the area, like all those consciousnesses, intruders who were coming against, probably against many of the things we've just been talking about, you know, projectiology, it opening up, it being more available to people, people having these experiences, people starting to question more, and a lot of the old belief systems starting to crumble away. They were trying to sustain that, and so they were coming against Dr. Vieira. This is my interpretation of what happened there. And he remembered the mantra, and so and you can read it in there in more detail. But basically, Nostradamus in the Centuries, and this pertains this particular quatrain, quatrain 27 in Centuries 2, contains what looks like the gist or the main meat of that mantra that came to Dr. Vieira's mind during that projection. And one phrase there that I love these phrases. You know, strictly speaking, tomorrow does not exist, right? I love that because you never actually get to tomorrow. you're only ever in this moment, like, and then time just stretches out ahead, and we just call that object of tomorrow, that thing out there in the future, we call that tomorrow, but it doesn't actually exist. What exists is only this moment here and now. So anyway. And then Balzac was perhaps the main precognitor, the one who predicted that these sciences were going to come into effect, and he communicated this very strongly in the book, and the character Louis Lambert in one of his books. So there's more information in chapter 12 that you can look at. This. There's 16 ideas that Balzac wrote in 1832 that later we see very clearly in Projectiology, and that's all laid out there for you. So that was it. That's covering off those couple of chapters, and it sort of brings a bit of the contextualization, the science stuff within science, and also in relations to precognitions of projectiology. And so with that, Kim, I think it's over to you.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And hi, everybody. Nice to have you here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to reread the book for a number of reasons, including, like I just shared before, noticing things that I'd forgotten that I'd read again. So I'll be talking about sort of just a brief review of the chapters where Valdo has set out what he calls different eras of projectiology, or the study of out-of-body experience. And as a general introduction, so I've grouped these kind of together, but as a general introduction, he makes the point that the projection of consciousness is kind of an archetypal experience, in the sense that it is found across all human societies and all eras. So it's reported from hunter-gatherers societies, agricultural societies, industrial societies, tribal and nation states. It doesn't really matter. In general terms, it would be interesting, and I think there would be some research that could be done as to whether there might be patterns of variation, right? That there's certain types of society where there's a higher prevalence of projections of consciousness and other parapsychic phenomena. But whether that is the case or not, percentage-wise, it's certainly reported everywhere. And one of the points that he alludes to in that chapter 8 that I thought was interesting, and I've expanded a bit in that passage there, is that he talks about how in the chapter he refers to Tibet and I think China, and how there's a lot of techniques, projective techniques have been lost, the writings have been destroyed. And it made me think that that has probably occurred across the world many times. In fact, if we look at the ancient cultures of Egypt, or all the writings that were just that the conquistadors destroyed in Latin America, sort of across South America, the techniques would have been lost and perhaps refound over the generations, and then lost again across the millennia. So the first period that Valdo talks about is the ancient period, which he times as the beginning of time to the 14th century. Now, the beginning of time is a pretty loose description. I think we're still unclear at this point when we would start saying that human society started. And what I also found interesting thinking about that is that actually covers some very distinct types of human organization and life forms. So indigenous cultures in all its forms, whether it's in African rainforests, out in the steppes of Siberia, or here in Australia, pretty much all had or have some form of techniques that we loosely group under the term shamanism today, a term that really comes out of Siberia, and it's been adopted for all kinds of indigenous sort of spiritual practices that involve trance states and de-intrusion practices and out-of-body travel and so on. So on the one hand, we have these sort of tribal cultures, but also into this period, we get things like the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Sumerians, Romans, cultures that had very elaborate religious frameworks, cities, hierarchies, and at least the Egyptians, the Greeks, and I think maybe the Romans had these practices of sleep temples. So religious sort of framework structured around out-of-body experiences, like the early projectariums, really, right? Where people went into purpose-built buildings with idealized extra-physical multidimensional settings to induce out-of-body states. And so Waldo refers to a few people from this early period who essentially were sort of early reporters in their writing. So we have really early written records, right, which is very different from obviously the tribal cultures of these. I think they're all Greeks, really, Greek documenters. And that's one thing that struck me about actually this whole passage really is that it's quite Eurocentric in a sense, because it's essentially, a lot of it goes back to the Greeks and the early European writers and so on. And it made me realize, thinking about this, that A, there's nothing in this book, but also I literally have no idea what records there might be of, China from that era, or Thailand, or those big kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa that existed around that same time, that had universities and all kinds of structures. Same about the Americas, right? So there's a lot of lost knowledge from this era, or at least we don't have it here, and perhaps we could do research in some areas and we could still retrieve it. So there's a couple of things that are relevant from this era and that kind of play on then into the next era as well, is first of all, this initiatory practices were often part of the experience. So to gain access, this was in the structures, right, to gain access to parapsychic phenomena, including out-of-body experiences, you had to go through initiation, you had to pass through certain hierarchical steps. And then the other aspect that came in different waves across this time was cycles of repression. So you might have had an era when, for example, the Greeks had sleep temples and people did those practices, and then often with the rise of Christianity, beliefs came in about these practices being negative, being bad, and then people were repressed and killed and so on, and had to take the practices underground. And that takes us to the next period, from the 15th century, which really comes out of that era of the Inquisition across Europe, witch burnings and all those practices. So esoteric means hidden, and during this period, people had to keep the knowledge and experiences of any kind of parapsychic nature, whether it was precognition, clairvoyance, or out-of-body travel, mediumship, anything like that, was dangerous to name. And there was an interesting, I don't have the quote here now, but there's a French sort of scholar of medieval times who essentially, the phrase, paraphrasing, was essentially that during that period of the Inquisition and so on, Europeans lost connection with their dreams, right? He's talking about dreams, but of course it's from the projectological perspective, it's our connection with multidimensional life. We got cut off through that trauma. And if you look at people that do a lot of past life regression type work or past life memories, there's a recurring theme is people remembering dying during this period because they're being persecuted for some kind of psychic events. So during that time, we had secret societies and mystery schools come out, things like the Rosicrucians, and I don't know, there's a whole host of them. I don't really know them. And those schools, on the one hand, held information, but on the other hand, they mystified and misinformed people about projection of consciousness by attaching, still there's these remnants of hierarchies, of having to go through initiations, and there was elements of control around these experiences. And one of the key characters from this era was Emanuel Swedenborg that Waldo talks about. And he was sort of an example of a false start of science, because Swedenborg was a well-established scientist, then who also turned out to be a prolific psychic and out-of-body traveler. But and he started by exploring these experiences in a scientific mindset, but he then fell into very strong religious beliefs and started filtering everything through those. So it didn't quite happen, the scientific part. And one piece that I found interesting with all of these characters, when I first read Projectiology, I was kind of intrigued why people like Honoré de Balzac, like he seemed super obscure, right? The person that Jeff mentioned before, and Emanuel Swedenborg less so, but why were these people kind of so prominent in Waldo's book? And it was really through the book Zephyrus by Mabel Teles that I discovered how, you know, Waldo had these multi-existential links to these people, and that's, I think, partly what inspires this. So then we have the exoteric period. So exoteric here means things have become open, public. People weren't burnt at the stake anymore. They might still be ridiculed, but less so. There was a greater curiosity and openness. And we saw a series of books coming out with a lot of personal accounts. And here are some that I mentioned in the book. There's a whole lot more. And I would highly recommend, you know, to use Projectiology as a resource to discover and then check out some of these different books and get a bit of a feel for the different stages in which people have written about the out-of-body experience. And then from 1966, that's where Waldo says the laboratory period started. So this is where the projection of consciousness entered the, I suppose we could say, proper scientific domain. Not that there weren't people before that took a scientific approach, especially with the societies for psychical research in the US and the UK. But laboratory has another ring to it in the world of science. But I would have to say that they, to my mind, they really highlight these studies highlight the issue that Jeff raised earlier when he was talking about science and the lack of replicability of experiments in this space. So in 1966, Charles Tart, the probably best known sort of parapsychologist with research in this area of altered states of consciousness, did this experiment with a woman who always remained anonymous, just called Miss Z. She was able to retrieve under laboratory conditions, I think it was a 5-digit number in an out-of-body state. Now that is quite an impressive feat, but it hasn't been replicated in that way. I think there's been other kind of attempts. And I used this in an article. I wrote an anthropological article, and among other things, I was arguing about the importance of accepting or treating seriously Aboriginal accounts of out-of-body experiences based on this scientific study. And a peer reviewer noted, quite rightly, I think, that one soul study doesn't really, establish very much, doesn't carry a lot of weight. And I think that is an issue if that's the approach we want to take. And that's not really the approach of projectology, but I think it's one of the hurdles to this projectology becoming more widely accepted in among other more non-multidimensional sciences. So other experiments that took place was Charles Tart with Robert Monroe, Carl Oasis, and I'm not sure the first name of Mitchell, with Ingo Swann. Another interesting. So Robert Monroe, if you don't know him, definitely check him out. He's a great author on the out-of-body space. Ingo Swann, also interesting psychic, and he did some really interesting remote viewing work. And there's been quite a few other laboratory studies, including more recent ones where people were trying to establish, and in their mind, establish that out-of-body states are the result of neurological events solely. And a lot of these studies sort of focus on physical measurements, the EEG, the brain activity, psychophysiology, what happens to the skin, what happens to the blood pressure, what happens to all these different indicators in the body, which for myself has limited interest. It's kind of it'd be interesting to know if there are correlates, but I think from what I've seen, it's very hard to be clear that there are clear correlates between certain states of the body and out-of-body experiences. Out-of-body experiences seem to have a lot of variation as far as what the body does at the time. And there has been very few studies really that have gone to establishing the reality, so the multidimensional reality in the way of the Miss Z study, which I find intriguing. I think there's been things like the IPC's fly-in, and I know other organizations, I think the Monroe Institute might have had fly-ins, but I'm not sure there's been any at organizations that aren't already on board with the perspective of this experience being multidimensional. And Jeff, did you want to say anything? I realize that I haven't actually invited you to do that so far.
No, you're covering it all off really nicely. So
Okay.
Happy.
Well, then just the last point really is when we talk about these different eras, it's important to consider that they're actually all alive today. So right now in the world, there are tribal societies still alive. And there are also, interestingly, a lot of people from non-tribal societies that are trying to, replicate or kind of adopt practices such as, I think, of ayahuasca, for example, or that seems to be the most appealing sort of traditional practices where people use drugs to induce a whole range of altered states of consciousness, including out-of-body states. And people often will also interpret the experiences in similar ways to the old tribal sort of practices. We still have esoteric societies operating, and Rosicrucian, Ekankar, Gnostic people. We still have people doing the kind of, writing books about their experiences and so on, without necessarily taking a particularly scientific approach, just kind of, sharing their stories more openly. And then we do have scientific studies today. So all of that is happening at the same time. And the other thing that is perhaps even more interesting from the point of view of us as consciousnesses doing our own self-research is to what extent are these periods alive in us today? So to what extent, for example, might we be influenced still by periods of life in our past existences where initiations were a key part, and there was restrictions on knowledge of out-of-body experiences, and we had to show respect to certain, sort of bow down to or show respect to certain leaders, or we had to hide our capacities and our abilities because we might get our head chopped off, we might get burned at the stake. Many different variations, right? But from what I've seen and what people have shared in different workshops and in myself, these things are still very much alive in us, and they will impact us, until we become aware of them and kind of recycle them. And
yeah, that was that was one thing that when we were talking about and preparing for this, that was one thing we both really resonated with us. Or it was an interesting perspective on self-research, like what percentage of the esoteric times and fears and results and traumas or beliefs and whatever else from that time is still in me, and from the exoteric time, what of that is in me, and how much of the laboratorial phase have I managed to build in myself, as it's relatively recent and really only in this life. So yeah, I find that one a really interesting take to study the self-research and ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's it from the presentation, and I believe that we might even be having a bit of a conversation about this last topic in a minute. But I think what's happening next, we can have people can have some discussion, right?
Yes, I'd like to want to hear from you. It's about from any of you, Kim or Jeff. It's about this idea of how society influences us to have more or less connection with the multidimensionality. So how, because you present the whole, phases that human being coming, and you also present some society that was in the book and some that wasn't, that had this period of projection. And so our small groups, right, is not everyone in the earth. So I want to hear from you a little bit more about that.
How society influences
us and our relationship with multidimensionality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to have a go, Jeff?
No, you go, buddy. I'll go after.
Okay. I mean, it's clear that there are I would say it's clear that there are differences, because just working in Aboriginal communities, the percentage of people who are open to and who speak about various psychic phenomena is very high, and it's normal, and kids grow up with that, right? It's just something that gets spoken about when people are, the deceased ancestors are coming through, they might be joining at the dinner table. Like, that's something that is just there. Very different from certainly my upbringing in Europe. I noticed a difference going to Brazil, and of course I was in Brazil surrounded by Conscientiology people, but also I was teaching English in various workplaces and stuff, and I constantly ended up having conversations about consciexes and out-of-body travel and all that stuff. And I guess because of the culture, right, the spiritualism and Umbanda, and it's just kind of everywhere. It's certainly in Rio de Janeiro, it's the only place I know, but it was very, very, very prevalent. And so, yeah, I mean, culture, so my take would be is culture is something that we absorb largely unconsciously, and it gets transmitted, down the lines, largely unconsciously if you're in a dominant culture. Yeah, I think the beliefs and the openness is really strong, which is why we see, like, say, Northern Europe, that took a very materialist bent around the 1800s. There's I think still less openness to a lot of these things than in other parts of the world.
Like you could look at the culture as like the container we live in, right? We're all in that environment. We're all influenced by it, and it's constant. It's all the time, and that sets a lot of, in your mind, a lot of conditionings around what do you think is possible, what's allowed, what's acceptable, and what's not. And you go to China. When I visited there, however long ago, you go to a park and there's people just moving energy and doing stuff. You'd be hard pressed to go to a park in Australia or New Zealand and see the people doing that. You might, and people, but the rest of us will be looking at them going, "Wow, that's weird." Like, wow, you might be a little bit curious if you're a little bit open-minded, but it's pretty rare for the people to be there. The good thing is, though, with these forms of communication, international exchanges, and more mingling, we're getting exposed to more and more. So the cultures are perhaps becoming a little more universalistic, each in their own rhythm and in their own way. But it's nice to feel that container we're all in changing and being permeated by different ideas. And I think you've got to have a strong sense inside of yourself of what you're okay and what you're happy with. Like, you define for yourself what's okay for you. Go in the park and start doing Tai Chi or moving energy or whatever it is you want to do, and be okay and inside of yourself with that. I think we start to evolve much, much more quickly when we care less about what other people think. And I don't mean that in a rebellious, destructive way. I mean that in a way, in a personally liberating way. We don't want to, do crazy, destructive things that harm other people, but for yourself. You have to feel free to decide entirely how you want to be, and that's tough. But yeah, that's sort of my take on it.
I can I jump in here a little bit? Yeah, just elaborating on that point, Jeff, I had very interesting experiences around this cultural aspect and attitude towards parapsychology in France. So while I was there, for those of you who don't know me, I was there living there for the last 7 years, just back in Australia last year, and met quite a few people who had very strong interest in these topics, but they were very reluctant to admit that, and they would meet me on a one-to-one basis, and it would be kind of a hushed conversation in a cafe, and they would say to me, "Oh, I admire you so much for being very open on the internet about your interest and involvement. I would never do that for fear of how people would perceive me," and so on. And I had a very interesting experience one weekend. A group of volunteers from different parts of Europe, some from Germany, elsewhere, we all met in Paris, and we went off to this big cemetery called Père Lachaise, where the founder of Spiritism, Allan Kardec, is buried. And it took us a very long time to find the grave, but we had such a great experience when we finally did, because we met a man whose family had been caretaking the grave for generations, actually. His parents had looked after the grave. In fact, it's the most visited grave in this huge cemetery full of celebrities. And the comment he made was, over the many decades, it was just incredible, the figures in society, politicians, even presidents, actresses, very well-known, high-profile people who came to visit the grave, but in public they were Catholics or different religions, and would never admit to that. But you go there and you see there always flowers all around that grave. So that was very interesting to learn about that. And of course, France has this long history of burning witches at the stake for their practices. Right.
That's really interesting. It reminded me as well, like I was in the Science of Consciousness conference, so this big one, and there's a big mixture of people, orthodox and heterodox scientists there. The orthodox obviously have usually that posture of looking down at the people who look at the stuff like we're more focused on, parapsychic things, those things you can't see and measure and touch to a degree, right? But a lot of them accept a lot of that stuff, understand it, know it, but in public are petrified, afraid of stating that in a public place and that are in front of people. No, so they do their materialistic science and talk about that publicly, but that other stuff, it's like private. And so this is a measure of the esoteric scars or stuff persisting through until today in top scientists around the world, and so it's fascinating. Like, how much are we doing and are people doing based on fear, or how much are we not doing based on fear?
Can I jump into this discussion? When I lived in Australia, I noticed a strong curiosity towards altered state of consciousness. And there are groups that they work with the synthetic ayahuasca. So you notice that people want to know more about altered state of consciousness, and because of the sensations. But looking at what you guys are saying, last year I had the opportunity to translate during the Projectiology conference, international conference, and they invited Charles Tetart. He presented a talk, and Dean Radin. And it was interesting to hear Charles Tetart talking about the experience, the Miseta, the one that Kim just talked about in 1960. And he talked about all these and the altered states, and now he's into meditation. And Dean Braden, the same, they do research and now they see the energy in the plants and things that I think the Russian did many years ago. And the sensation I had with these two scientists, especially Tetat, because we gave class and talked about his experiment and that he carried on so many years ago. It was this. He talks about this, he studies this, but he didn't jump in and say, yeah, this is true, this is a fact. Even he talks, he research, but he never had the experience himself. He studied something far away from him. But one of the things he said, I never prioritized. He never gave importance of having the experience himself. And so it's interesting, you talk about fear. I think there are many other aspects. I think the scientists maybe do not jump in and actually accept that and actually have the experience themselves and see what's going on. Maybe, I don't know what you guys think, maybe it's the very strong materialistic paradigm that even though it's kind of an attempt to change that, is still very strong. I don't know, you guys could comment on that.
I mean, my interpretation of Charles Tart is that he, because he wrote a book, I don't know if you know his book, The End of Materialism, where he's putting out that, making a very strong case for all the evidence for multidimensionality, but he's still maintains an uncertainty, right? Like, it kind of keeps it as a possibility when it comes to the out-of-body experience. And I guess in that case, it's kind of what I was saying before, right? There is very little evidence of the kind that you can replicate. Like, you can do all the psychic stuff, precognition, they've replicated it to death. Telepathy, they've replicated it over and over again. Out of body experience, like in the kind of way like Ms. Z, not so much. So I think that's one element. He's maintaining his trying to maintain his scientific objectivity, even though I'm pretty sure he thinks it's a real thing. But the other thing, I get the sense with him that he's it's less materialism so much, and more the Buddhist influence, which is its own thing, right? Of like, these phenomena are all just an illusion as well. We shouldn't invest our energy in that and just focus on meditation practice. And I think that's in itself quite stymieing. I'm not sure where that fits into these categories, probably kind of in the ancient / esoteric block, right? But yeah.
I think also we are in the contraflow. It's not easy to have a projection. It's not easy to work with that and study that, because sometimes it really needs a lot of effort for, at least, I don't know if for everyone, but most of the people I know. And I think this materialistic world that we live, this planet, and the culture influence us a lot. And so hold us back. We are in a contraflow. So even to apply a technique, just telling, for me, it's like I have so many other things to do. And it starts to be difficult, and I understand that someone that is a scientist trying to study projectiology and not having himself a projection is, and I mean, most of us here, we had already have a projection that make us more, open to that. And
in some cases it could be that they've never had their own experience, but depending on the individual, there's probably a number of reasons, right? And others could be around money. Like, if they take that stand, they won't get the research grants, they'll be excluded from the club that they were previously in, they'll be stigmatized, ostracized. Some are seeking rewards, prizes, and so on, and this kind of study doesn't really bring those kinds of things. There's perhaps many reasons, and maybe perhaps some of you guys out there have other points of view that you want to share on that as well. Feel free to to share if you've got any thoughts in the area.
I make a part of a group that studies neuroscience. And I joined this group last year, and it's very interesting. There is a great teacher, and we discuss many different things. And there is a demand. The teacher himself, he had a projective catalepsy many times. And he said he freaked out, but he never went to see, not never, but he tried to understand what's going on, but it didn't fit on the understanding of the structure of the brain or what's happening, in a sense, trying to explain that. And I think when you guys were saying, I think some of the sensations, what we experience during an out-of-body experience, a projection of consciousness, it is something new for some people. The sensations are so not so familiar, and it comes through a fear and the lack of possibility to explain that. And I think this probably is one of the things that block people to go and move further. And this can be one of the reasons among many others, but it's interesting to observe how people react to something that is totally new and they never experience, and there is no cognitive background to understand that. And so it's quite interesting, I think, if we understand a fear and a new phobia as well, to face that and say, what's going on here? That my sixth sense or my understanding, the paradigm or my understanding of studying, or I cannot understand with what I have.
Any other comments or questions? Or?
Well, hello, friends. I'd like to take this opportunity to make a question to Jeffrey, Kim. Well, if you consider those periods in the book Projectiology, what do you think, what kind of perspective should we take today to help to make projectiology a more consistent science? What kind of achievement, what kind of movement do you think we could try to improve? What kind of challenge do we have today?
Yeah, I think our challenge is, in an intimate way, I think it's about having the disposition and the interest and seeing the results to get the motivation to do deeper self-research and self-confrontation. So the whole self-analysis, self-diagnosis. Even tonight we were talking with friends, and the idea of, like, if we want to improve individually, collectively, that requires a more precise diagnosis, right? The more precise and accurate our diagnosis, so the closer we get to approximate certainty around certain natural human conditions and factors, and the more critical we can be around the illness industry that exists and masquerades as the health industry in many regards, or the food industry, or all these different industries and money-making enterprises, right? It's when we can, while remaining lucid and not crazy about it all, but the more we can improve our ability to have self-experimentation and continue to refine and challenge ourselves to get better at measuring and challenging. And that may also mean different techniques, like, projections. Ulysses, I know you've got a whole series of ideas around how can we project and get better and map things out and kind of measure things and develop things. One thing today, for example, during this talk, is I'm using a bit of technology. I'm using this wee device here, a random number generator, and just tracking and seeing what's happening during the different phases of the conversation, right? And when there's the introduction, what was happening, the graph is one sort of thing, and when I was talking, it was more one. Then Kim it changed again. I might be able to share this with you guys later. And And when there's this question and answer stuff, it's sitting really close to like 0. So, which is like, you know, like not going one way or the other. And so we can find ways to motivate ourselves to try to get better at reading and understanding ourselves, the environment, and everything else. And get good techniques and tips from various people, Ulysses, like I know you've got up your sleeve, all sorts of good things. Kim, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea with that random number generator and having tools like that in our life too. So my thoughts are just briefly going on from what Jeff said. I think developing a laboratory approach with ourselves. So I realized that I was just, when I talked just before, I was very much focused on the external laboratory of measuring and stuff, but to really be disciplined with ourselves in terms of writing down our experiences, and not just, you know, what we do during the night, but, you know, the energy sensations, the time, all those factors. I think that would help. But I really have a sense that we are going to be struggling for a long time, as long as we have there seems to be a really strong divide between a micro minority of people who are consistent lucid projectors, if we're just looking at out-of-body experience. And, you know, many of us who are interested in the topic, who have the occasional out-of-body experience, but are not able to consistently replicate that, you know, not consistently choose where we go, not consistently kind of repeat things to be able to properly understand, work together, and so on, you know, and remember the experience even. So I think that's going to be, for now, I see that as a big challenge. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to overcome that, other than through each of us individually, you know, working on improving our projectability.
Silence is golden, but feel free to make it silver or anything else. Like, any other comments or thoughts, guys? Mashiko, how's our timing for the next 3 exercises and stuff? I'm not sure how that is.
Yeah, so I think if no one else has any questions, maybe we'll go into our breakout rooms now. So a couple of ideas: you can ask any questions you have about the readings, you can talk about your experiences, you can talk about the techniques. We'll put some ideas in the chat room, and I'm going to send you to your breakout rooms in a minute, and we'll stop recording, okay? And then we'll bring everybody back in about 10-15 minutes. Okay, so
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. Thanks, Magali. So see you soon, guys.
So I just put here in the chat so everyone can see. The technique will be the mental concentration technique. That is, the chapter is 201 and the page 434, right? We are going to put that in the forum. We are also going to put that in the WhatsApp. So our meeting is ending. So we would like to thank Jeffrey and Kim for facilitating this meeting. It was really good presentation, and also a great synthesis of the chapters of the month. So even who haven't read the book has a perspective. They really synthesize that very well, and it's registered, so it's good because we can watch again and other people can watch also. So we would also want to thank everyone for participating, and we want to invite you to participate in the forum, reading, and also to discussing our discussion continuing in the forum. So our next meeting will be 19 June So the 19th of June is always a Saturday. It's always the third Saturday of the month. And the next facilitator will be Ana Paula Lage and Jacqueline Cowen. So the pages will be 83 to from the 83 to 120. So that's it, guys. Thank you very much. And see you in the next meeting. Okay, bye.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everyone.
guys.
Goodbye.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
guys.
Guys,
everyone.
bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.